Every year, the NFL tells us the same story. This guy is generational, not just good, not just great, once in a lifetime, can't miss prospect. And every single year we fall for it. Fans, analysts, teams, shoot, me too. Because the idea is simple. If a prospect is truly generational, then the outcome should already be decided. They should be the best player in their draft, the one everyone else gets compared to, the one who defines the era. But that's usually not how it works out, because if you go back through draft history, some of the most hyped prospects ever weren't even the best player in their own class. And that's where things start to break down, because now the question isn't, was this player good? A lot of them were. The question becomes, did the generational prospect actually become the best player of their generation? Thus the term generational. And once you start asking that, the question gets uncomfortable, because sometimes they got it right. Sometimes they get it completely wrong. And sometimes the talent had nothing to do with it at all. So today we're gonna run through a few examples, breaking down some of the most hyped prospects the league has ever seen, and putting this generational label to the test. And once you see the pattern, you start to realize generational does not guarantee greatness. It just guarantees attention. And the first time we saw this, ironically, they actually got it right.
But is he a franchise player? Is that too great a burden to put on a man who's got a TD interception ratio of 2-to-1?
The year is 1983. Before the draft became a spectacle, before Mel Kiper, social media, and every pick became a headline, there was already a quarterback everyone agreed on. Stanford quarterback John Elway. This wasn't even a debate. John Elway was the prototype. The big arm, the mobility, the confidence. He was everything a franchise quarterback was supposed to be. And evaluators didn't hesitate. They didn't say maybe, they didn't say potential. They said he can't miss. Future Hall of Famer, guaranteed cornerstone, and for once, they were actually right. Elway stepped into the league and became exactly what people expected. A leader, a winner, a player who could carry your team deep into January, although early in his career, what happened after that would usually end in disaster, but the point still stands. Because later it amounted to 2 Super Bowl championships and an actual Hall of Fame career that defined an era. If every generational prospect turned out like that, this video wouldn't exist. But it does, so let's see where things get complicated. Because even in a draft where the hype hit, it didn't separate him the way people thought that it would. Because in that exact same class, there was another quarterback, less hype, more questions, a very different story on draft night, by the name of Deion Marino. Marino wasn't labeled generational, he didn't carry the same certainty around him. In fact, he fell all the way to pick 27. Now that allegedly has nothing to do with football, it had to do with his off-field activities, but all in all, he wasn't supposed to be the guy. And once he stepped on the field, everything changed. Marino rewrote expectations. He had a 5,000 yard season in the 80s. It wasn't even fathomable at that time that it was possible. He had touchdown numbers that reset what elite quarterback play could even look like. An offense built entirely around his arm because it had to be. And now we're looking at that same draft in a completely different way, because the question isn't, was Elway great? He was, clearly. But the real question was, is he clearly better than Marino? Better put, was he 26 picks clearly better than Marino? And that's where it stops being so simple, because this is a real debate. One that's still ongoing over 40 years later. They had different styles, different paths, but relatively the same level of impact. So now even in one of the cleanest examples of a can't miss prospect, they still end up in the same place. The generational player that wasn't alone at the top. But once you see that, you start to realize the label doesn't separate players the way you would think it does. Because if even the sure thing still ends up sharing the spotlight, then what exactly did the label guarantee? And the next time we see this, oh boy, they didn't just get it wrong, they missed completely.
Tony Mandarich is the draftee. This guy, once in a lifetime.
Okay, now we're not talking about a debate. This time, there was no gray area, because coming into this draft, there was another can't miss player, Michigan State tackle Tony Mandarich, aka the Incredible Bulk. And the way people talked about him is gonna sound familiar. Once in a generation, the best offensive line prospect ever. A physical presence that didn't even look real, because it wasn't, but we'll get there. Strength, size, power. He was expected to dominate, to anchor a franchise for the next decade. And when Green Bay took him second overall, it felt like the obvious pick. You don't overthink a player like that. You take him, you sign him, you move on. But here's the part that changes everything, because that draft was loaded. Barry Sanders, Deion Sanders, Derek Thomas. 3 Hall of Famers, and the Packers managed to pick none of them. Multiple players who will go on to define the league, all in the same class, and right in the middle of it was Mr. Sure Thing, Tony Mandarich, who stepped into the league and did not look the same. The dominance didn't translate from college. The consistency was not there. The impact never showed up the way it was supposed to, and at no point did he become what people promised. And now the gap starts to show, because while Mandarich couldn't find his footing, Barry Sanders, on the other hand, was doing something very different. He was the definition of electricity, an MVP with all-time production. He was a player who could carry a game and change it with one single run. That kind of player that defense tried to plan for but just couldn't. Because it didn't matter what they did, he was going to find space and still break something open. And suddenly this isn't a debate anymore. This isn't Elway versus Marino. This is something else entirely. Because the generational prospect wasn't even almost the best player in his draft. In fact, he might have been the worst. And it doesn't stop there, because Deion Sanders became the greatest corner ever. Derek Thomas became one of the most feared pass rushers ever, breaking the record for single game sacks, which ironically he still has today. So now we're looking back at this same moment and realizing something uncomfortable. They didn't just miss on that pick, they missed in one of the greatest drafts in NFL history. They saw the traits, they believed the projection, and they got the player completely wrong in a historical fashion. And now the label starts to break down even more, because you've seen both extremes now, right? When it works and when it completely fails. But the next case is different, because this time talent wasn't even almost the problem.
With the first pick in the 2012 NFL Draft, the Indianapolis Colts select Andrew Luck.
Let's shift gears here, because this time there was no debate around the talent. Andrew Luck was the clear-cut #1 prospect in his draft. He was the prospect. The safest quarterback evaluation since Peyton Manning, who honestly deserves a section in this video, but he's not as fun. Smart, accurate, tough, everything you wanted and nothing that shit didn't. The kind of player that people compared to all-time greats before he took a snap, and early on, it looked like that. Luck stepped into Indianapolis and immediately changed things. Playoff appearances, comeback wins, big moments where he looked completely in control, and there was a stretch where it felt like no game was over. Down late, didn't matter. Pressure, didn't matter. He had that type of presence. That kind that makes you believe your team always had a chance. And for a moment, it looked like the label was right again. This is where the story turns and Colts fans start to get a little upset at me, because football doesn't care how talented you are. If you can't stay on the field, the hits stay stacking up and it's over from there. It wasn't just like he had one bad injury. It wasn't like he had one bad season. It was repeated punishment, week after week after week, because the Colts could not protect them, and for a couple years it looked like they didn't even try. And when you watch it back, you see it happening in real time. Pressures, sacks, hits after throws, all of which adding up, and slowly but surely the career that everyone expected started to wear down until one day it was just over. Luck retired in his prime, not because he couldn't play, but because the cost of playing was just way too high. And just like that, the generational career never fully becomes what it was supposed to be. Now let's look at that same draft again, because this is where the contrast hits. Wisconsin quarterback Russell Wilson, 3rd round draft pick. He was called too short, not your prototypical quarterback, and there was a couple questions around the guy. He wasn't supposed to be the guy for the franchise. He wasn't even drafted to Seattle to be the starter, but he walked into a very different situation. An elite defense with the Legion of Boom, a strong running game with Marshawn Lynch, and a team built to support a quarterback instead of expecting him to carry everything at the age of 21. He was allowed to grow into it, and the results spoke for themselves. He won a Super Bowl, almost won 2, but that's a story for a different video. Years of consistent success, a stable run at the top of the league, so now you're looking at it again and you're like, same draft, same position, completely different outcomes, because one career was built and the other one was torn down. That changes how you look at everything, because Andrew Luck was everything he was supposed to be, but the talent alone wasn't enough, not without protection, not without support, which pointed out an even bigger issue, because even when you get the player right, it still doesn't guarantee a good outcome. And the next example takes it even further, because this time they didn't get the situation wrong, They got the player wrong.
With the first pick in the 2014 NFL Draft, the Houston Texans select Jadeveon Clowney.
Now we get to the clearest example of this, and honestly the draft that inspired this video, because this is just like Mandarich. There was no debate. South Carolina defensive end Jadeveon Clowney before the draft was thought to be the most feared defensive player in college football, and it was one play that could explain it why. One hit versus Michigan that was explosive, violent, and instant. That kind of moment follows you through the whole draft process. I can't tell you the amount of times that I saw that highlight during the draft season. It's the kind of moment that makes people just stop asking questions, because physically, Clowney looked like everything scouts dreamed about. He had the size, he had the speed, he had the power, and he was a defensive end who could do things that other players simply couldn't. So when Houston took him number 1 overall, it didn't feel like a decision. It was automatic. You don't overthink a player like that. You take him, you sign him, you move on and expect dominance. Now here's the reality. Clowney had a fine career. He's been productive, made some plays, definitely made a scouting report or two, but never really at the top of it. He never took over the league the way we expected. He didn't have a stretch where he was the clear best defender in football. And here's where it starts to get wicked. Shout out to Zevi. Because the real story of the draft wasn't the number 1 pick. It was 12 picks later with Pittsburgh defensive tackle Aaron Donald. Maybe you heard of him. Completely different conversation. He was kind of the anti-Clowney. He was too small. He looked limited. There were no real splashy highlight plays, so he didn't get the same type of hype before the draft. No one was calling him generational, but once he stepped on the field, everybody wished they did, because Aaron Donald was unstoppable. Winning Defensive Rookie of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year 3 times over, 8 All-Pros in a 10-year career. He was a player that can take over the game from the inside. The league didn't see anything like that before at that level. Offenses had to change how they blocked just to deal with him, and sometimes that didn't even work. Double team him, triple team him, didn't matter, he's still gonna have impact. And suddenly this entire draft looks different, don't it? Because now it's not even close. The most gifted player in this draft wasn't the most dominant. They're not even in the same conversation, because Clowney kind of exposed what scouts fall in love with: traits, potential, what a player could be. And Donald represented what actually wins games: production, consistency, and relentless impact. And that was the difference. They didn't just miss the mark, they picked the wrong player entirely. And once you see that gap, it changes how you look at every generational prospect after that. Because now the question isn't who looks the part, it's who actually plays the part. And after all this, you start to realize something. The word doesn't mean what we think it does.
What does that mean? I don't get it. What does that mean?
So now that I've been yapping for all this time, what is a generational prospect? Because we've seen every version of it. John Elway, they got it right, but there was someone else. Tony Mandarich, they got it completely wrong. Andrew Luck, the talent was there, but the outcome wasn't because they didn't support him. And Jadeveon Clowney, they just picked the wrong player entirely. So now the label starts to feel even more different, because it's not really about being the best player anymore. It's about expectation. It's about projection. It's trying to predict something that hasn't happened yet and treating it like it already has. But the NFL doesn't reward projections. It rewards production, consistency, availability, impact over time, yada, yada, yada. Those things don't always show up in a player that they're talking about before the draft. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they show up somewhere else, later in the draft, in a different system, on a better built team, and that's what makes the draft so unpredictable and honestly so fun. Not the hype, but the reality that once the game starts, nothing said pre-draft matters anymore. Because a generational player doesn't always mean the best player. It doesn't guarantee greatness. It means someone that captured attention before the story was actually written. And if history has shown us anything, the real story usually belongs to somebody else. Thanks for watching.